Hi guys from Pax Europiana, this time again from a beautiful place in Upper Austria where I'm spending my birthday weekend here this week. I'm getting 53 on the 23rd of August. Thanks a lot for all the friends who think about me, and thanks a lot, I'm back healthy again. And I'm very interested in the issue of Afghanistan this week, and I'm actually since 30 years very interested since I'm politically active and interested in the past. And now there is a lot of debate about Afghanistan, and I see a lot of bad information out there, and I would like to correct that. And I would like to discuss in this video about why Afghanistan is such a mess, and why this happened, and why basically what most of the people say in the media, it is because the Americans have supported the Mujahideen and created Al-Qaeda. This is about very simplistic and actually wrong impression, which anti-Americanism, which is now ripened after the tragic fall of Kabul. And of course, the fall is very chaotic. It's a tragedy for the people, and it's a very bad reputation for the West, and I'm actually very sorry that it happened. But you cannot blame everything on America which you don't like, and you have also to understand the background, what happened, because Afghanistan was messed up by the Soviet Union. This is very important to understand. This is very much the direct result of, you can say, historically, the British Empire's conflict with Russia. But very concretely, I'm not talking about historic times. This week also we celebrate 50 years of Bangladesh independence. And also it's not so long ago that India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, they were obviously part of the British Empire. And then the Cold War started very heavily, exactly in that years of the British partition, 47, 49, and when the Soviets took over all of Eastern Europe. And then basically the fate of Afghanistan was sealed when the confrontation, the war came between Pakistan and India, first in 65 and then in 71. And then it came to these terrible interventions of the Soviet Union, first in 73, when they toppled the monarch of Afghanistan. Then in 78, the second strike, when they toppled their own president, which they have imposed first in 73. And then they have invaded in a third time, first then full military invasion, when their puppet, which was installed in 78, was then not good enough, was threatened, then and they have invaded in 79 in the December invasion, which the whole world has condemned, the free world. And then the story of the boycott of the Moscow Olympics, and then they have led a terrible war against the people of Afghanistan for a decade. They were as well bleeding themselves dry in that war, financially mainly, but also the Soviets lost a lot of people in that terrible war. But it was very much the Soviets which messed everything up. 73, the coup, the fall of the monarchy by the Soviets. 78, and then the second military coup, where a lot of people were killed. They killed the whole family of that president. They have imposed first, and they have helped to gain power in 73. Then the military intervention from 79 to 89, a decade in Afghanistan. And through in this decade, obviously, the opposition, the Mujahideen, the people who were fighting against the Soviets, were supported financially and militarily by America. Who else? And there was nobody else. They could ask for money and weapons. They got it from them. They got it via Pakistan. But it's not that the Americans have created the Mujahideen or the Americans have created bin Laden. This was just, one of the battlefields of the Cold War, where the Americans were supporting the underdogs. And it's this whole kind of anti-American European reportage, which is people who are as well informed because they saw some guy, they even don't care to read Wikipedia. They have seen some Rambo movies, I think. That's the level of information of many of the commentators, which are now very big Afghanistan experts and always happy to blame America. America, of course, I also love it, and it's the protector power of NATO, and it's the anchor power of the West. But you cannot blame everything, like America would be responsible for everything that happens in the world. And when something goes wrong, yes, it has to be criticized, and the evacuation effort could have been much better. But then to kind of this riling up anti-Americanism is, of course, completely wrong. The management could have been better, but it's many American soldiers who really help a lot of people to escape. And without America, we Europeans couldn't help anybody because we are completely useless. We couldn't have a single airplane in Kabul airport. And it's not only America which was surprised by the rapidity and the speed of the Taliban's and their reconquest after '96. They have now conquered a second time Kabul. And as I said already, it would have been much better to divide Afghanistan, like Yugoslavia. But for this, I see nobody supporting, not even many of the Afghan leaders are supporting that. So, okay, the Taliban's will have their regime now for some years, and they will fall again because there is simply too much diversity and too less cohesion in the Afghanistan society for a central state. They will crack down very brutally. That will result in a lot of people being disenfranchised from this kind of political terror regime. They will fight, and they will find somebody else to support them. There will be somebody to support also them. Later, sooner or later, the Russians will... There's enough weapons anyhow in Afghanistan, so it's not about the financial support and monetary support, and it will be very bloody, and it is a tragedy. But they blame it very much on the Soviet Union, because they are very much responsible. And if you don't like to blame the Soviet Union, blame it on the way the British Empire has conquered South Asia and then left South Asia after the fall of the British Empire, more or less, under the end of the Second World War, because they were financially bleeding completely dry with winning against the Nazi disaster. And that was basically the reason why they had to withdraw very fast, because it's also very much about economics. Let's not forget, and the reason why the British Empire left basically was they were in bankruptcy in '47, and the Americans were not ready to back up the empire. So the British in '47 in the summer basically ran away, and very hastily they decided to divide the country in two parts, in a Muslim part and a Hindu part. Obviously, this was not the way the divisions of countries I would recommend. I say division is very good, but not along religious lines, and not just in two parts, because they created a lot of injustice by running away and so fast and so chaotically, and millions of people died because of that one. There was an intermediate civil war, there was a lot of ethnic expulsion and cleansing, and there was a lot of criminal activity in this division. And it seeded basically that the long-term future of these two states was also not viable. And that's very much connected with Afghanistan, and I will explain you why. Because '47 was, of course, a big disaster, and the division, but economically, both Pakistan and Afghanistan, they stayed in the British imperial customs and currency system, so-called the sterling system, until '66. Yeah, and why '66? Because then the Indians left, and why the Indians left? Because they had a lot of expensive in the war against Pakistan, and they both, because they were both proxies of the West until '65, but then they were disappointed that nobody really supported the war so well, because it was impossible to support one side against the other. So the British and the Americans simply didn't really know what to do with all the violence, and somehow tried to sanction both and tried to talk both into kind of a armistice. And the Soviet Union obviously exploited that impossible position of the West in Pakistan and India, and they made approaches to both. And it ended up in the so-called Soviet-Indian Friendship Treaty of '71, which is today the basis of Indian foreign policy, with these successor treaties, Russia-India. And it's now a little bit changing. That's, of course, also good, because India should be a part of the free world completely and leave BRICS and join OECD. But they are just gradually doing that, and not fully. So that '71 treaty, and then later the second second India and Pakistan war, where basically Bangladesh was created, because that was Bangladesh. It was only two parts, British India, until 71, and then in that war, Bangladesh created itself, and it was also a very bloody and tragic war and a full disaster. But that was basically leading India ever closer into the Soviet camp. And they were not a Soviet proxy completely, but they were a very Soviet-leaning state from 71 to 91. And that's still then in the 90s, it only gradually shifted. So Bangladesh was created, and that had, of course, a huge effect on Afghanistan, because this kind of Pakistani king, the Afghanistan king, he was seen as too neutral for the Soviets. And at that time, remember, the Soviet Union was directly bordering country. Tajikistan was a Soviet republic, and also Central Asia. So for them, it was very important, and so they toppled the Afghan king. And that was the start of the whole tragedy, which started then from 71 to today, to 21. It was, of course, a complete disaster in Afghanistan, starting very much as a consequence of this drive of the Soviets towards the south, towards the warm seas, if you can call it. That's, of course, one of the efforts to dominate Afghanistan and dominate Pakistan, because that would be convenient for the Soviet planners and for the Russian planners to have two proxy states south of their southern border. Yes, so that's basically how the whole mess the British left in India, and their chaotic withdrawal, and then the bankruptcy of first in 47 of Britain, and then don't forget 61 was also it was the end of the Sterling area. Then came only 71, but this was the very much the crisis decade of the West. And it led to the complete breakdown of the Western alliance system, which Eisenhower built in Asia and in Southeast Asia. I will explain that very shortly, because most people have forgotten it, and it's very dramatic. Because Eisenhower, he was the big military winner of the Second World War, and it was a global war, not just in Europe. But obviously, then when the Cold War started, and he was the first president to really for 8 years manage the Cold War, he built a very strong alliance system. He inherited already NATO in Europe for the defense of Europe, but for the defense of the Middle East, and we were talking Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Southeast Asia. That is Southeast Asia, obviously. There were two other organizations created, similar like NATO. The one was the Middle Eastern Treaty Organization, and it's called, it has also a different name, but remember it very simply, like NATO for the North Atlantic. There were sister organizations called METO, that was the Baghdad Pact, and the Manila Pact. Maybe it's better to describe it as the European Pact, the Middle East and the Southeast Asian, because Eisenhower built a ring around the Soviet-Chinese camp, yeah, because China was fallen, and there was the war there was Korea War, and that was, of course, the deciding point. And so he built three alliances around the Soviet Union and China, because at that time they were not split, they were still united. So that was the Middle Eastern Treaty Organization and the Southeastern Treaty Organization, similar like NATO. But they disappeared, and they lived quite long. They all lived from the 50s, from Eisenhower's time to Nixon's time. But after Nixon's terrible mistakes, he overstretched in Vietnam. He really very hard went against the North Vietnamese. And then the reaction came politically, and he fell after Watergate. And then the decline of the West started very rapidly with the chaos of this lack of trust of the institution. Then Nixon falling, Carter, Ford first being very soft and coincidental president and withdrawing, and then Carter the complete withdrawal. So in this chaotic years from basically 73, where there was again the financial shock of the end of the gold standard, where Nixon withdrew in order to fund the massive investment he made in Vietnam, and then the chaos in South Asia. I just described it with the war. India lost to the Soviets, and Afghanistan and many other countries then going to lose. This was the terrible 70s. I made a video about it already. When the Western policymakers were just sitting in their policy circles, I remember I was meeting some of these politicians in my youth still. They were counting the countries they lost in the 70s. This was the situation of Western policymakers, desperately counting the countries they lost to the Soviet Union between 73 and 70, and Reagan when he was elected, and then he was in power in 81 only. Yeah? So that was almost a decade where Western policymakers were just sitting and counting the countries they lost. Yeah? And they lost a lot. And they lost the two alliance systems, obviously, because this Middle Eastern alliance after the fall of Iran in 79 made no sense anymore because most of the countries were lost and no longer interested, yeah, and didn't believe any Western promises. So this MITO was lost and it was dissolved, and the Southeastern Asian Treaty Organization was as well lost, yeah, because of the withdrawal from Vietnam and then the complete takeover of all Vietnam and Southeast Asia by the Vietnamese, and so it was a complete disaster, and America withdrew from these vital lines, and basically from 73 onwards, the big withdrawal, it ended only with Reagan gradually then rolling back the Soviets because they were bleeding out in Afghanistan, and there was also the oil shock, and they were simply too sclerotic and economically no longer viable, and the strategy to focus back on Europe and make Europe rich again, if you want, rich again in the 70s and 80s was working out, especially under the guidance of Reagan. But the two alliance systems, additionally to NATO, which Eisenhower created, evaporated in 79. And so that was, of course, a big disaster. And country by country was lost. And Afghanistan was just one of the many countries which was lost from 73 onwards, but then ultimately occupied. And then it was just logically that Reagan then started to supply them with arms, the opposition, the people of Afghanistan who were fighting. And that the most radicals have won then out in this confrontation, and that this war attracted a lot of extremists from the whole world, also from the Islam extremists, and also people like Osama bin Laden. Yes, it's one of these tragic consequences of the Cold War to which we have digest to this moment still. Yeah, the reality is like that, and also tragic consequences of September 11, and so they are the kind of indirect consequences of the terrible confrontation of the Cold War with all these terrible defeats America has suffered, and we have also suffered in the 1970s. And remember, it was always then many Europeans to appease Russia in this kind of context, like Brandt, like Olaf Palme, and like Bruno Kreisky, who were basically then celebrating the end of the West, like many do it today. But, you know, the West didn't end. I have made the point already, very good comment of, I took it from Twitter, 15 years after the fall of Saigon, the West was winning economically. It was not a big war which Reagan led. It was minor proxy wars, yes, in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, in other places where basically America has funded domestic resistance movements, no matter what was their ideology. They were there, they were fighting, and that was what America was funding and arming. Yes, okay, you can reproach America for that. They should choose their allies more wisely in that moment, but it was not that they created the Mujahideen or they didn't create extreme Islam. They were just thinking it useful to support it. Yeah? In the moment when the Soviet Union, in their third effort, really fully invaded Afghanistan, after 73 takeover, 78 takeover, 79. And just, because let's focus on Afghanistan, what happened then, because there's always this approach that America wants to rule the world or is the world policeman. But no, America, after the 1990 victory or 91 withdrawal and the end of the Soviet Union and the end of Yugoslavia, was very much not interested in Afghanistan and the world, and these other conflicts, because there was enough to do. Anyhow, Yugoslavia was burning and there was the Bosnian War, and America took actually until 94 to wake up, because Bill Clinton was really very uninformed when he came to president. So he became the president, and then he was Afghanistan was basically without any major foreign intervention or support, because the Soviets were in chaos in 93. Remember, there was this 91 putsch, the 93 attack on the parliament, and the whole basically a Russian civil war for the power in Russia between 91 and 93. So they were definitely not focused on Afghanistan, and America was also not focused on the world. They were in their kind of post-war peace dividend, a lot of domestic issues, and Afghanistan was left for these 3, 6, there's a variation of it, different mujahideen groups from different ethnic groups and different ideological and geographic sectors of the Afghan society, which were in a very bitter struggle for the power, because they didn't want to divide the country, which was much more logical, but they all wanted to dominate the country and dominate the rest. So then they were fighting a very bitter civil war for 4 years, from 92, fall of Najibullah, to 96, and the fall of Kabul. And then the most brutal ones, which were by the most important regional power which was active, of course, the southern neighbor Pakistan. They have funded and financed the Taliban, and they took the power in 96. And they kept it until America was really ready to fight back and to go to Afghanistan, but not for a nation-building effort or not for creating a better Afghanistan. It was the revenge action for 9/11 and the effort to make sure that there will be no kind of such a disaster happening again in Afghanistan, from Afghanistan soul, because obviously this very chaotic Taliban group, very brutal, very disastrous Islamist extremist fighters, they didn't have any kind of good governance capacities. They were doing their revenge action against everybody else and imposing their medieval kind of worldview on the people of Afghanistan after all these disasters that happened already. But they also were somehow in debt to the Saudi citizen Osama bin Laden, who was funding them in the times and supplying them and training them in his base camp, and that's what Al-Qaeda is called. It was the Pakistan base camp for the Afghan resistance fighters, which was training them. Al-Qaeda, the base, yeah. So basically, so it happened. So they let him do whatever he did, and he did all these criminal activities, which led to this major, most important terror attack, one of the most important and the most cruel ones against America, in 9/11. And he did it from Afghanistan Seoul, wherever, who knows if the Afghanistan Taliban really knew what he was planning, but he was in this kind of extremist worldview that he has to create the big provocation and this revenge for British American troops mainly being in Saudi Arabia since the Kuwait War and the Kuwait liberation of 91. And then he decided to do this terrible terror attack, and he did it. And obviously America couldn't not react. It was impossible in that mood. And then Europe and NATO helped, and so we ended up in Afghanistan in our 20 years of trying to improve something there. It was very terrible. There was many crimes as well committed by the Americans there. It was very brutal, because obviously when you don't have a good strategy and you come only in an anti-terror mission in a country and you have never made up your mind what is the long-term future of Afghanistan, once you take over the external security, the first victory was relatively fast. Yeah, after some months, the most of the key strategic parts of Afghanistan were under American control. But then, obviously, when you don't really know why you went, because you went only for revenge or to take one terror group out, then you don't have a big plan. Then you are basically then the authority. You are in control. If you break it, you own it. Yeah? And then obviously there was never a big debate what should happen long term with Afghanistan, because people like me have argued all the time that this is not a viable state. And it will not be also now under the Taliban. It has to be broken up, but if they don't want it, that will not happen. Yugoslavia was obviously because there was a strong feeling of the separate identities from the way it was created in 1919. But there was basically no willingness to have 6 or 7 new states created neither by the international community nor by the Afghan elite, because they all were basically thinking in Kabul, the people you talk to then, and that Afghanistan should be united because it's our Afghanistan. Yes, it's good, yeah. But obviously most of the people outside were not thinking in that kind of 1960s or pre-73 Afghanistan ideas, and so it was never any consent by most of the constituent people. So it was from the start, after 2001, a failed mission, because there was no clarity what to do with it, and there was no consensus to divide it in its constituent parts after a working system, not like the British have left India, because running away, like now the Americans have done it, and leaving chaos is not the right way to do it. We need a system in the world where you have a managed, assisted and negotiated breakup of failed states. And I know it's very difficult to do, because who wants to take the responsibility, and the cost attached, but the cost of keeping failed states, which are imperial kind of constructions of the past, mainly of the British Empire or of the French Empire, and they are not well managed. They cannot manage. There is only one elite imposing their vision on the rest. And then obviously that is, and then you need, when you have the control of such a state for whatever reason, or when you see it's not working consistently, it must be a conference about the future of Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and then there must be a well-studied and consulted process how to break that country up. Because the national unity of these states cannot be that Austrians or Americans or British have to die for. This is then completely wrong, because Afghanistan is not a viable state, nor is Somalia, Congo, Sudan, and Yemen, and Syria, Iraq. And these are all, and you can blame, obviously, the British for many of that long in historic terms, but that's futile. It's the question what we do now in the future with such states. And of course, also when you do it then very badly, you have a lot of ethnic population exchange, violence, brutality, and then you have the responsibility for that, because you have supported the breakup. And that's obviously what the West doesn't want or is not ready to take. So we can continue to have disasters like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan for the long term, where never really viable states will be built. It's a bit better in Iraq, because the elite has so much money with its oil wealth that they can pay and smooth a lot of ways through. But nevertheless, long-term viability is zero of Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan. And it's not so on. It's not that this, I'm talking not about 200 states. I'm talking about 15 states in the world, and they are the problematic ones. And we shouldn't be the ones holding up the status quo, but we should consolidate the really working states. And, that is, again, my big call, maybe to conclude it and also to sum it up. The holding up Afghanistan unity doesn't make any sense, blame the Soviets for all this. Let the Russians now and the Chinese now, and they were always also a big power interested in Afghanistan. They're also a bordering country. Let them see if they have some plans for which work for Afghanistan. But it's after we have evacuated, it's no longer so much our business. And we should have an international Afghanistan conference of the West, see what kind of state countries should be developed. And if there are some Afghans then later who are ready for such a concept, then we should support the ex-Afghanistan new states in the future. And that will be probably 4 states. It's my call for Afghanistan. And nevertheless, what we really should do, because that is also the conclusions of this, we are now as well in a very difficult decade after 2014 and the fall of Donetsk and the annexation of Crimea, which was the one watershed moment, and now the fall of Kabul. We are again in a similar kind of decade like in between 73 and 70 and 81. We need to see if Biden is really capable of a real doctrine of focusing on Europe and providing European security, which is the vital moment now to really have Ukraine and Kosovo, Bosnia, Moldova, Georgia in NATO and securing that. Or we have to wait for a next American president which will, like Reagan, really then contain Russia and China and lead the West to victory in the Second Cold War. These are 2 options. I personally thought Biden will be that president, and he is, he has still 3.5 years to go. It's just half a year. But obviously he is in the process of consolidation. So I call everybody of the decision makers in the Eastern European periphery, from Albania to Georgia and from Kosovo to Ukraine, to work very intensively to be able to be integrated in EU and NATO very fast, because now it's an option. Let's see if he's ready for progress. He did also some good things like the visa waiver for Croatia. That was very good. Yeah, he has also done several other, you can call it minor things, but we had a victory in Moldova. It's also important. So it's not that we have nothing to show on the balance card. Yeah, he has also cracked down very hard against corruption in Albania. Also, that is very good. Yeah, so there is some positive aspects. Obviously, the anti-Americans will now always have a heyday because the pictures of Kabul are a tragedy. And obviously, the commentators connect everything only with America. And that's, of course, something I want to fight. I want to have a stronger NATO as consequence, a stronger EU, a more enlarged EU and NATO. And this is how we won ultimately after the fall of Saigon, with all these measures of focusing back on Europe, on the election of Maggie Thatcher and of Ronald Reagan. This is how we won the Cold War, with Kohl and with the unity of the West in the European Union, in a stronger NATO, with the NATO double-track decision of 79 as a response to all this, with nuclear rearmament and basically an arms race with the Soviet Union, which they couldn't afford. Yeah. So the patterns, and also, of course, with changing the energy pattern of the world after the second oil shock. And obviously there was then the oil glut after 86 and 85 in the alliance with Saudi Arabia. So it may have to repeat that pattern logically. And so decarbonization is very good. Yeah, the breakup of OPEC is very important, and then the rearmament of the West very important. Yeah, and the stronger NATO focused on Europe very important. And then also most important is to win the competition with China and with Russia economically. We do have to get simply much more innovative technology-wise, and we have to win this confrontation in the technology and innovation field. And this is anyhow already happening, but the efforts must be redoubled. Yeah, this is how the 80s were successfully. Yeah. And so we need obviously to refocus on that one. And that's the way forward for the second Cold War, to lead also to the second victory moment, like we had it 1990 and 89, in these very amazing years from 89 to 91, to the fall of the Soviet Union in 91. And this will come again, there will be the fall of the Russian Empire and as an organized entity, and the whole philosophy which we have now had successfully with the fall of the Soviet Union, and also tragically it was also very painful with the breakup of Yugoslavia. Also, it has to lead to the breakup of the Russian Empire in a logical conclusion, and we should then, contrary to what I said in the past, also work systematically to make sure that the Russian Empire is no longer, and it's falling into 28 constituent pieces, which I have described already. So that's very important, and we should redouble our intellectual efforts, our academic efforts, but also strengthen the Russian periphery. And this is absolutely very important. That's of course complicated, I understand that, but first of all, we also should make sure that we have a very much a better strategy for Central Asian countries in the trade relation, in the Eastern Partnership, and giving them an alternative to Russian and Chinese domination. And that's, I think, even much more important after the fall of Kabul. And you see also, when we have to do anything, we anyhow need Tajikistan and Uzbekistan to provide the logistical basis and also the supply routes and everything else. So much to do. Yes, this was my video of the day. Thanks a lot from this beautiful site here in Austria for following my debate. And I'm very sorry that we are so bad country in Austria, not taking more Afghan refugees. I reiterate my call. We could do much more. We have done it in the past refugee crises. We were really very open and helpful from the Sudeten crisis, in refugee crisis after the Second World War, and there were hundreds and thousands of refugees in Austria after the Second World War, flooding back from the threat of the Soviet Red Army, and there were so many coming from all over Eastern Europe to Austria, and many settled here and were successfully integrated under most difficult situation. Then also the crisis of Hungary, the crisis of the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakian, and then of course 250,000 Soviet Jewish immigrants came via Austria into freedom, and then also so many people from ex-Yugoslavia came to Austria in the Balkan Wars, from Bosnia and Kosovo especially, and so on and so on. We are now 9 million people, and we are the 13th richest country in the world. We are at close to $50,000 GDP, and we are really a very good country, even if we are more people. So it's not a problem. The system, if it works, can integrate more people. We should maybe cut taxes and reform our system a bit in order to be more productive, because since 2008 especially, we didn't grow so much anymore in Austria in GDP per capita, because we had not really an economic response which was adequate, like reducing taxes. That's of course another topic. Let's not cover everything in this video, but it's really time for better policy in Austria, in the EU, in NATO, in the US. And I hope the fall of Kabul is maybe this kind of watershed moment, like the annexation of Crimea was, where basically we have reached the bottom moment, and from now on count 15 years plus for the victory in the Second Cold War. Hopefully faster, but if it takes 15 years and we win, it's fine for me. Thanks a lot for listening. All the best. Bye. Thanks a lot.